Hi, Jean, or hey, JP. Hey, JP.
Hey, Paul.
I always get confused. There's Jean-Pierre, Jean-Philippe. There's all these JPs in my life
Yeah,
at the moment with Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, and then you're the third JP. I've heard that there's another one somewhere out there as well. I don't know if you know more.
yeah. I always just try to go by GP because it's much easier to pronounce.
Yeah. Okay. I wrote you the other day. What's the symbolism of all these JPs? But I haven't heard a good answer for that yet.
Yeah, I
Right. So
mean,
you.
for the JPs per se, I don't know, but many of us have at least John as our first name, and it's a fairly common biblical name. There's also John Vervaeke in Canada, so there's a few of us, but I think it's a fairly common name in Canada in general. Jordan is different, but even still then, there's Jordan and then John the Baptist who used to baptize in the Jordan. So there's like the figure of John the Baptist is fairly popular. He's actually our patron saint here in Quebec. So it's not too surprising that at least John would show up fairly often.
Okay. Yeah, the very first video I saw of Jonathan Pageau, I think the title was Symbolism Happens. So you don't always try to explain it. You just know it's like, oh, that's interesting, a pattern there. And the more that you notice the symbols, then like kind of the meaning becomes emergent, something like that, right? So.
Yeah, and you have to try to not get carried away too far with symbolism. There's people who sort of get too excited, I think, and who don't restrain themselves enough and then see too many patterns and become almost schizophrenic. So like you have to sort of hold yourself back and like see like what traditions have come up with as a system like that many people have worked on and have made sure that, okay, this is coherent. Because if you just sort of go on your own looking for patterns, you can try to overfit the data and find all kinds of patterns that are not really there. So the number of JPs is one of those that I'm skeptical that I don't sort of want to touch too much.
Don't want to read too much. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, what we do, so at Manifesto, we run programs, courses, weekends, retreats for guys, where we try and reconnect them to a sense of enchantment in the world or to a sense of meaning or purpose. And the idea is that unless you do that, then the world can seem very gray and meaningless. And that what is increasingly is for people these days, right? So when they do discover that, then yeah, the exact thing you said can happen. It's like, oh, then we start seeing like fairies everywhere because we've been too used to a world without fairies. And so yeah, there's a need for, yeah. Okay, great, JP. Thanks for that start. And we actually had a purpose with what with meeting today. And so thanks. This is the second time you're coming onto our YouTube channel. Appreciate that. It was a fantastic conversation you had with Owen last, which I really enjoyed.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and last week I think we both watched a talk between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau, which really for the work that I'm doing seems to be an important milestone in some ways, or like an important shift somewhere. And so we emailed a bit back and forth, and I really wanted to kind of help you to kind of interpret like, what does this mean and what's actually happening here. And what I wanted to do first of all is just to frame it a little bit in the understanding of like how this is meaningful for Manifesto and our work. So if that's okay, I'll start off with that and we can dive into it. So yeah, I think that the core of what Manifesto is about helping men to understand how to find direction, purpose, and meaning, which can really connect to the depth of their being in a society where that's becoming increasingly difficult, as kind of like postmodern world has emptied a lot of value out of existence for a lot of people, then being able to find that. And so Manifesto has its roots in the men's movement. There was a guy called Robert Bly who wrote a book called Iron John, which is a story which really draws on this wild man archetype. And I think a lot of men have been very motivated by that. There's two guys called Gillette and Moore who kind of took some work from Jung about archetypes, where they specifically drew up about king, warrior, magician, lover, and that's been a big part of the men's work that's been happening. And I think when Jordan Peterson came onto the scene, then that kind of really opened up a whole new aspect of life. And I can certainly say for myself, you know, this is what now 4 years ago or something like that. I started seeing this stuff 4 or 5 years ago. Then there was kind of like objective material reality. And, you know, I'm trained as a scientist at university. And so that's like reality. And that's what I, you know, primarily am into. And then sometimes I could, like, you know, there was this spirituality world, you know, the idea of stories and archetypes and stuff like that. And it was kind of like the collective unconsciousness, and it was floating somewhere up there, and there wasn't any direct connection between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, what Jordan Peterson did is I would say he was more firmly standing on the platform of material reality, but he kind of, like, you know, cast some ropes out and created some connections. And even maybe, you know, I don't know if one could say, like, Jonathan formulated like how he's standing with one foot in each world. I would say more like he pushed a toe a little bit over into the other world or something like that. But more pointed to, like, hey, like, you know, or like start creating that path. Mm-hmm. And so myself and a lot of other people have followed that path. And I think Jonathan Pageau has been one of the guys who's maybe more firmly over on a kind of symbolic understanding of existence and reality. And that's been able to really create that bridge. But then what I really saw now, which seemed very meaningful, was Jordan Peterson himself having pointed the way, feeling the pull or the necessity of having to either take those steps himself or to, you know, formulate a new formulation somehow. Mm-hmm.
He's going further into the story, you can say. And okay, that all helped me understand much better why you care at Manifesto for this kind of discussion. Basically, it's about narrative, about the reality of narrative, or the reality of patterns, of non-material stuff. Mm-hmm. So, and it's part of a broader set of intellectual issues that have been popping up like crazy over maybe the last century, especially the last few decades, where for a long time, since probably the Renaissance, people were trying to evacuate anything that is non-material from the world. You can even see it explicitly in some early thinkers. For instance, Galileo, when he was doing his physics, was studying, let's say, billiard balls, like rolling down inclined planes and so on. And because he wanted to describe them with mathematics, he had a philosophical issue to deal with. It's the fact that, well, those things don't look like they're just math. If you look at a billiard ball or whatever, like, they seem to have qualities. They seem to have some sort of essence that isn't just math somehow. But if he was to acknowledge those non-material properties, then his math would be very incomplete. But his math seemed to work, so he had sort of a puzzle to fix. And the answer he went with is, he said that, okay, we're going to take out the qualities from the objects, and we're going to put the qualities just in our souls. So, like, over time, you sort of have a stretching away between the objective reality and the mental reality, you could say, or the narrative reality, where the world of facts and the world of values just get pulled apart. And Galileo said this explicitly, and so that he could just keep doing his mathematics and describing the external world. And people kept doing this. The natural philosophers, the scientists, and so on kept doing this. But over time, a bunch of issues appeared as we kept splitting those, where I'm just going to mention a few, but lots of issues have happened. The biggest one, arguably, in the last few decades has been the mind-body problem. Is as you keep separating mind from matter, at some point you have the problem of, well, I mean, we humans do have minds, kind of. We cannot really argue against that. Some people have, by the way. There was a movement of eliminative materialists for a while in philosophy of mind, who wanted to argue that because everything is material, then mind doesn't really exist. It's kind of an illusion, or the way we think about it is largely an illusion. There were people trying to do that, but by and large, people now acknowledge that, okay, even though we're somehow made of matter, we also have minds that are not just matter. So we need to find the relationship between the two somehow.
So they were basically just saying human beings as an extension of, like, billiard balls bumping into each other randomly as a result of kind of initial circumstances. So it was taking Galileo's initial experiment to its logical conclusion if you just applied that to all of reality, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but in the last few decades, lots of people in philosophy of mind and cognitive science have been arguing that, well, this cannot completely work because you can never talk about human consciousness this way. Like you cannot reduce our feelings, our sensations, our emotions, our narratives down to just matter. It won't work. Then lots of philosophers have been arguing for this. So this is one issue. Another issue has happened at the bottom layer of physics, where you have some other arguments given by people such as Ned Block, who's an American philosopher, who argues that, well, reductionism just cannot hold because there doesn't seem to be any reduction base for that reduction to go to. If you sort of go down to the bottom layer of physics, there's just potential there. There's no pattern even. There aren't atoms to make things. Like there's just fields of potential. So you cannot reduce
what's reductionism? Let's just get basic here. What when you say reductionism, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, when we, let's say, initially we're talking a world of object, let's say, objective reality, typically the picture we have in our minds is a reductionistic one, where everything sort of comes down to material constituents somewhere. And these material constituents would be like atoms or some sort of particles. And for a while, this worked, because for a while, we just sort of kept discovering smaller and smaller particles, and they were tangible, really. But like over the last 100 years, and maybe about 100 years ago in physics, and even in philosophy of physics too, at the time, both were much more closely linked than they are now. People recognize that, well, if you just go down to the bottom layer of physics, actually what you have is potential. And people have been arguing over how to interpret this. Actually, people have mostly stopped arguing over it because it doesn't seem like you can fix it in physics. Richard Feynman, one of the most famous physicists of the 20th century, said that his favorite interpretation for what's going on there is to shut up and calculate. So for a while, people just ignored the issue because they didn't seem like, because people could tell that it was going against the reductionistic paradigm. You cannot just keep reducing everything because you just end up with nothing. But they didn't have any clear alternative, because since Galileo, we had forgotten how to have a non-reductionistic worldview. So like people didn't know what to go back to.
Isn't it strings that are infinitely thin and or something like that? I mean, I read this book some time ago called The Fabric of the Cosmos, which kind of try to put forward the latest ideas of, but it's all very tentative, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there are people who are still trying to come up with reductionistic accounts, and I think that this could be one of the ways to try and do it, to try to reduce everything down to strings. People try to also go towards a multiverse where like everything is ultimately still determined and goes down to particles, but rather than having real possibility from which those particles can emerge, you just postulate that they sort of all exist in all kinds of worlds in a multiverse. So people have been trying, but there's no dominant position there. I would argue that the best picture is actually Aristotelian. There have been like Aristotelian or Thomist philosophers who have been explaining this in terms of old school metaphysics, like the ones that people had before Galileo broke it, basically, where you just add those different layers of beings, and it had the advantage of not only solving the problem at the bottom layer of physics, but it also solved the mind-body problem and some other problems that I haven't brought up. For instance, you have others in general, like, are scientific objects real? You can say, are propositions real? When let's say a scientist is studying something and he uses a proposition to say, okay, for instance, the charge of an electron is whatever. When he says this proposition, is he saying something material? Like, the proposition itself is not something material, but if you want to say that it's true, then you need some way to say that this non-material thing exists and is true, or an equation. Let's say the equation E equals mc squared. If you want to say that this is true, and it must somehow exist. Obviously, it doesn't exist as a material reality. Like it's not a cup or whatever, but it still exists. And you want to say that it exists, or else you're cutting off yourself at the knees. If you want to do science, you have to say that the objects of your reasoning are still real somehow, or else you're just losing your time in a bunch of illusions. So this is another problem, the problem of universals. And we're getting now to problems that are, let's say, more abstract, that aren't as concrete, let's say, as the mind-body problem or the problem at the bottom layer of physics. But like, as people have been starting with, let's say, the more obvious problems, such as the mind-body problem and the problem at the bottom layer of physics, more people have been connecting this to a lot of other issues, including the meaning crisis. So the fact that, okay, we've destroyed narrative, like we don't take it as something real. We kind of like Galileo did, we sort of took narrative out of the world and we tried to put it just inside of our own minds, where, okay, narratives don't really exist in the world out there. They're just, let's say, projections of our psychology. And we sort of could get away with it for a while, but it ended up generating a meaning crisis, because if it's just in our minds, then we're not sure that it's real. We're not sure that it's going to be the same kind of narratives that other people have. It seems artificial. Let's say, if we just say that narratives are inside our own heads, and we've gotten a meaning crisis out of this.
Yeah. So I was driving with my son yesterday in the car, and we were talking about, like, the order of moving into our new home. And I said to him, like, well, you know, like, there are many stories that start with the men heading off and doing things by themselves, kind of like forging the path ahead or something like that. And he said to me, he's 14 years old, and he says, well, stories aren't that important, right? Like, that's not so important. And so I said, oh, well, what do you think is more important than stories? And he said, well, what about logic? and I'm all like, well, you know, like, you know, can you say that logic could exist inside a story? And he was like, huh, okay. Oh, that kind of got him thinking, right? But what I'm getting you saying is, like, that we've kind of taken, you know, for me, like, logic, we can have scientific logic, we can have mathematical logic, we can have all kinds of different logics, but maybe the overarching logic is a narrative-driven logic, right? And actually all of these, or at least that's what I'm getting a lot from the work Jonathan Pageau is doing, and also from Jordan Peterson, is that these logics are embedded in actually different stories or narrative structures of existence.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what, let's say, the hierarchy would be in there between the logics and the stories, but at the very least, like, with the intuition that your son had there of saying that, okay, logic is real. Well, logic is not something that's material. It's super abstract, and for a very long time, for like the past 25 centuries, really, one of the major positions, and at times the major position in philosophy of mathematics, was to say that, like, logic and other abstract entities exist, like, they really exist, they shape reality, and they're in the mind of God, because they're not material things, so that they have to be in some sort of spirit. They would even exist if the world didn't exist. Like, the Pythagorean theorem would still exist even if there was no universe. So these objects exist like outside of space and time somehow, but they do constrain the world that we live in. So even when you get to saying things like the fact that logic exists, like, you're affirming the existence of something that is very non-objective, let's say, that is not an object, that is not a concrete object, and yet it exists. So once you acknowledge this, it's very, I mean, the reality of stories is sort of just nearby. I don't know if it's easier or harder to show the reality of stories, like, or is logic within stories, or are stories within logic, or maybe stories are a kind of logic. I'm not sure how the hierarchy would go exactly, but it's almost the same thing. Like, people live in patterns in the same way that, let's say, triangles live in mathematical logic. There's once you start acknowledging the reality of those kinds of patterns, you end up solving a bunch of problems. The problems that I laid out earlier, you solve the problem of human consciousness, because if you can acknowledge that that you can make, let's say, jumps within the different layers of beings, and that all of those patterns will exist, then you solve your problems. You say that, okay, consciousness, and that's what people have been doing in cognitive science, by the way. You say that if you take not individual cells, but if you take the entire network of, let's say, human neurons in a body and an environment, if you take this whole complex causal network and you don't try to reduce it down to something, but you rather take it as a whole, this whole has emergent powers. It embodies a pattern that is not reducible to its constituents. And this pattern is then conscious. That's what human consciousness is. It's a non-reducible pattern that is embodied in all kinds of neurons in a body, in an environment, with people, and so on. And you do this sort of at all layers of being. So the fact that we talked about earlier about the, let's say, the fundamental particles at the bottom layer of physics, if you just add, like, potential at the bottom layer of physics, you could not explain why particles emerge. But if you can say that, okay, well, patterns exist, for instance, the pattern of electrons and protons and whatever, then you can explain why from just potential at the bottom layer of physics, you can have forms, you can have patterns that will shape this potential into actual particles, like protons and neutrons and whatever. And you can do this at different layers of being. And this will even be true of, let's say, groups. And people in cognitive science have been studying this too, like group cognition. It's even getting somewhat popular on YouTube. You can hear many people talking about collective consciousness and that kind of thing. Jung talked about this as well, but the fact that in the same way that you would not reduce my mind to, let's say, individual neurons, you would not try to reduce it. You can also have distributed consciousnesses among different people that, it's not going to be the same as my human consciousness, and it's hard to study that kind of stuff, though people are trying. But you can definitely say, at the very least, that sometimes if groups are doing something well, you can see the emergence of irreducible patterns that will shape in novel ways the potential of the different people in the group. So, and this happens all kinds of time. I'm sure you have tons of experience of this stuff happening, where you gather a bunch of guys together, and then by shaping the emergence of something good out of this group, if you set the, let's say, the network right, in the same way that you can set up like networks of neurons right, you can have the emergence of novel things in the group that will transform everyone in the group. And you could not reduce it to sort of just the individual members of the group. If you just look at the individual members, like, they'll end up doing things that are not explainable if you just look at themselves. You have to take the whole to be able to explain what happens in the parts, in the same way that to be able to explain what happens in my neurons, you actually have to look at the entire brain within my body, within my environment. So once we start looking at these kinds of patterns, you get into narratives very quickly. So it becomes like clear why we've kept some stories for thousands of years. Why we use them? Because they're teaching us things about higher level patterns that are actually real and that we can live in. It's useful for us to know how these kinds of higher level patterns behave, because we actually live in them. And we try to evacuate that for a long time, and we've become poor at detecting higher level patterns because of this, but we still have the ability to perceive them. We just have to practice. Like, it's not as obvious for us to perceive these patterns as it was, let's say, to someone in the Middle Ages, where they lived in a world that was full of higher level patterns. Like, things were obvious because they were always participating in group rituals. They had large families. Like, they were steeped in all kinds of myths that they could tell to one another, that they were telling their children and so on. Like, people lived in a world where the patterns were much higher, and we've somewhat lost this, and it's part of our meaning crisis, why we're so lost. Like, we have a difficulty recognizing everything that is not just material, but we can rediscover this. Like, we still have the ability to do so. We still have people we can interact with. We have a large reservoir of stories we can draw from. So, like, even though things are sort of bleak right now, like, there's a lot of hope, and I think it's one of the reasons why people have latched on so much to what Jordan is doing. Like, he's taking these stories, he's taking these higher level patterns and bringing them down to a way that people can see them again. Like, it is like reopening an entire layer of being that people didn't have access to.
There was a lot of information there. I think we started at reductionism. Let me try and see if I can give, but we started with reductionism and seeing how the rejection of the idea that something can exist outside of just material reality has led us to a kind of a blindness to seeing how patterns exist. For example, logic as just simply a way of seeing logic as like patterns, that ways of being and reasoning and modes of existence that we kind of can see from like the vast amount of data that's out there somehow. And you connected that then to the meaning crisis, as in saying like, well, that's the reason that we've lost meaning. And so what Jordan Peterson has been doing is kind of been somehow looking at these high level patterns and then bringing down very concrete examples and connecting it to all kinds of little stories from his clients and things like that, that kind of like suddenly opened up a new way of seeing things for a lot of people. I've often heard the word like kind of given hope, or kind of, and part of me sometimes when you're talking, part of my brain says like, like, oh, it's such a detailed kind of, like, is it really necessary for just normal people to like understand the fundamental material of existence and reality and talk about ideas of like consciousness and existence and ontology and all these very, very complicated things, right? Because not everybody, most people, they go to work in an office every day and they need to know how do I like, use Microsoft Outlook, and how do I do this and that, what's the formula for spreadsheets or something like that. But somehow like, there's just a fundamental mode of being that can be shifted from considering these things. And Jordan Peterson somehow, and so that's my next question really, is like, why now, and what did Jordan Peterson do that enabled the shift somehow for so many people? And then some people, it seems like, were not able to step into the shift and actually, provoked quite a violent reaction in broad parts of society as well. What's actually happening there?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I think it has to do directly with the remark you made about the way I explain things. I tend to think metaphysically, and there have been philosophers who have never stopped doing this, really, who have always pointed out the flaws in reductionism, but they were typically not always that popular, because like people who care about metaphysics would listen to them, but like people in the broader world, as you said, like it's too far from them. Like they won't really latch onto it. But I think why Jordan has been popular is sort of twofold. On the one hand, he does very little metaphysics. So he stays to the level of stories that will connect with people more directly. So it's sort of let's say the man, but there's also the moment, the fact that we've been abstracting away from material reality so much. Like we've made ourselves so blind to patterns that what Jordan is doing can now resonate with people. I don't think it would have resonated with people as much 30 years ago. Well, the way he talks about stories, for instance, it probably would not have worked when people were not as hungry for it. When one example that Jordan often uses is the idea that we've been living on the corpse of like our dead ancestors. We've been sort of devouring away a corpse, and we can still keep doing it for as long as there's still food in there. But at some point we start running out, and that's when people are more receptive to what comes elsewhere. So I think let's say Jordan has been more popular because he's talking, I've looked for it. So he does sometimes mention metaphysics. I mean, it really matters to me because I mean, I've done enough science that if I wouldn't deal with those objections, I could never take stories seriously. So it's important for me to go through the arguments at the different layers. Otherwise, it just would never get off the ground for me. But like for people who don't care as much about all of those other layers, the fact that Jordan just helps them see the patterns like is really enough to give them hope, to make them see that life can be meaningful, and then they can start on a path and things will go well. And like it's even parallel within, I talked about metaphysics, and there's also a big shift going on there. For I mean, even though there have always been Aristotelian philosophers saying that reductionism won't work, still for a while it was bearing enough fruits. You could still live on the corpse of our dead ancestors, because people could still do that for a while. They weren't very motivated to go back to older metaphysics, but people have been for the last 20 years. There's been a revival of Aristotle, for instance, because it could address a bunch of problems that reductionism cannot address. So like maybe to just summarize what you asked earlier, I think it's because we're running towards the end of reductionism. We're running towards it in metaphysics, but also in our daily lives. Like we cannot just keep reducing everything down to matter. People can tell that it's not meaningful enough. Like we want something more. And because Jordan is able to do that in a way that people can, like that in a way that everyone can grab onto, like people will be drawn towards him. Or if people really want to keep evacuating stories, then they'll immediately recognize him as a villain that they need to oppose. So that's why like people either love him or hate him, because he's like bringing people back to a much older kind of worldview. So it's, you'll love him or you'll hate him, I think.
Okay. So yeah, if we're getting to the end of reductionism, and I think, like we all appreciate, like science gave us, like, mobile phones, technology, healthcare, global infrastructure and stuff like that. That's been fantastic. And so it's been clear there's been some massive advantages with our kind of, progressive Enlightenment thinking. And then for me, it's been the Corona crisis and just the confusion that I see that arises in people, that's showing like, okay, well, there's a need for something else. And a lot more people are more and more realizing like there's a need for something else. And so right now we're standing there at this point, and there's kind of like a whole new universe opening up with many paths leading in many directions. You're a practicing Catholic, I understand, right?
Yep.
I'm an Orthodox Christian, but I've actually been listening a lot to a guy called Nicholas Kotar. Maybe he's also been on the Symbolic World. He talks a lot about Tolkien and his thoughts about like what kind of stories are we telling as a society, and what are the nature of those stories. And these days, if I go, I at one period someone gave me a Netflix subscription. I watched some series in there, and it's incredibly entertaining. It's like really gripping stuff, but very, very dark. That's what I really felt. It's like this, I kind of like get sucked into this like really juicy underworld in many ways. And what I also see is a very big element, and that's something we have a lot of focus on the men's movement, is the focus of community and togetherness and communion in a group of people as well. And so it's like, how, as people are coming to the end of the scientific worldview, or maybe the reductionist worldview, and looking for what's next, what's the fail-safe way of orientating yourself without feeling like you're being like, pulled into an ideology or into like some outdated, broken way of thinking or something like that?
That's a good question. It's worth noting that there have always been people defecting from reductionism, but and we can see bad ways of doing it, even starting from the Renaissance. At the same time as, let's say, you had scientists trying to reduce the world, sometimes those very same scientists would also be trying to look for very esoteric ways of interacting with the spiritual. So like Descartes was like doing his physics and his mathematics and so on, but he was also like looking for the Rosy Cross and all kinds of weird esoteric stuff, because people had started divorcing the spiritual from the material. And like you can see a whole wave of occultism really in the West, in the parallel as reductionism was growing. You also had like an underground wave of occultism rising. And like today we can see like those two extremes more clearly than we could back then, I think. Like, so on the one end you'll have very reductionistic materialists like Richard Dawkins, for instance, and on the other end you now have like, we don't have that much stats on that, but it seems like there are a few million pagans, like people who just will say outright that they're witches in the United States, and like practicing all kinds of weird rituals, and like it's all basically the New Age stuff, but more serious, I would say. And I think this is possible because when people notice that reductionism is false, then if you don't graft yourself onto a tradition that add a coherent structure that was non-reductionistic, you can just float off onto your own kinds of non-reductionism and go kind of crazy. And like there are people, you can find them within symbolic kind of thinkers who go a bit crazy. Like if you spend time on forums and so on, you'll see people who like once they start like understanding that the world isn't just material, then they start latching on to all kinds of crazy patterns because they don't attach themselves to any current tradition. Like they're trying to rediscover all of the other patterns by themselves, and they just go crazy. So it's important to use a tradition that actually worked, and you can to some extent look at what is hopeful and what isn't, and you can try slowly to jump into traditions to see what bears fruit and what doesn't. As you said earlier, people can still tell, let's say, gripping stories today, but they're often not very hopeful. Like they don't typically have the resurrection at the same time as they have the cross. So there have been traditions who have understood the world as made of those different layers of beings with like stories that actually exist and are coherent and allow people to live for thousands of years in them. So those structures are probably very coherent and very conducive to actually living a good life. If you try to do something on your own, or you try to jump into something newer, you're taking a risk. Like it's not like I have any knockdown argument against it. It's not like I think it's impossible, but it's super dangerous, and we have to be careful of that. So like I would, and it's not like I can even advise people to jump into this tradition or that tradition or whatever, but like if you can find something with people who seem virtuous around you, who have cultivated a worldview where there are different layers to being, that's what I would try to do. Like try to see what's around you that you can actually participate in. What kinds of communities with integrated metaphysics can you try to cultivate? If you try to do something on your own, it's super risky.
Yeah, the European Men's Gathering this last year, we had 3 elders. One of them was a Zoroastrian, one of them was a Taoist, and the third was an Orthodox Christian priest as well. So that was a really interesting space to be in, and we really appreciated kind of like the frank discussions that could be had there. And I wonder if, part of the problem as well is that conversations about, this is conversations about religion, it's been kind of removed somehow from the public sphere, or made so aggressively polemical that it's hard to have those as well.
Yeah.
But I still see a risk, and I don't know how to deal with this, of, kind of like mixing and matching. And this is basically what the New Age has always been about, right? Because you can find plenty of overlap in all of these things. So it's like, oh, I'm just going to take the best of all of them and then make my own thing as well, right?
Yeah, that's unlikely to work. It's super tempting.
Yeah,
I think it's a lot like, let's say you want to start training, so you want to become more fit, and rather than dedicating yourself to one thing that works, you can just keep thinking about it and never doing anything, or you can try to like hopping from one program to another and not really making progress. Like you can look at the ways in which you make progress in your different areas of life, and you'll see that you actually have to commit to something. You have to submit yourself to something that works and commit to it at least for several months or several years, and then you see what happens, and then maybe you can try to reassess and move. But like if you're starting out and you're hesitating between different traditions, or you think you can collage different traditions, like you're making the same mistake as someone who is like morbidly obese and who like doesn't want to commit to any kind of particular exercise because he thinks, oh, well, this is good, but this is good over there, and never actually gets fit. Like you have to commit to something for a while to get any results. This isn't just in religion. Like any sort of training will require you to commit to something for a while.
Yeah, one of the guys in our network, Cadell Lost, I don't know if you're familiar with him. You'll meet him on the May gathering. He said, he kind of had a warning. He said, if you're a young man, be incredibly careful of your desire to usurp the father figures, or to know better than your elders, or than to, and I especially think, we're living in a culture which glorifies youth and glorifies, the innovative. All art is about like destroying what was there before and replacing it with something new thinking. And, basically that's the only standard, it seems to me, that art is often held up to these days is how innovative is it, which isn't a bad quality by itself, but like ideas of beauty seem to have taken a second seat to that as well. And the European Men's Gathering this year, we've actually decided to embrace this tendency, because we see it influences society, and it influences us as well. And so we're actually calling the next European Men's Gathering the Death of the Patriarchs. And I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail, but we're actually going to enact a ritual of killing the patriarchs, because this is if you look at pagan religions, then they're pretty much all founded on a patricidal tale as well, of the killing of a father by a younger one. It's a part of the Christian myth in a way as well. There's a lot of those in the biblical stories, obviously as well.
Well, yeah, it's a kind of flip that you can use, let's say, modernity against itself, because let's say, because we like the new so much, we've been living in shorter and shorter time spans. You can say we try to make something new, and then you have to make something new again and new again and new again. And you can feel that time is just contracting, that there's always something new. Like there are so many new things every day that you can't even keep up. Things just keep getting newer and newer. And like you can, let's say, kill the recent patriarch, like whatever new thing has popped up over the last few years, you can kill that.
Yeah, they're getting easier and easier to kill by because they're like fruit flies.
Yeah, and you can actually do that, like kill that recent patriarch by going back to an older one, like to something that worked 2,000 years ago, whether you go to Asia or in the Middle East or whatever. But you can use this modern like trope of killing the patriarch to go back to a much older patriarch.
There's a Danish businessman who started some pretty successful IT companies. His name is Ronald Hammer. He has a TED talk where he talks about, he studied theology originally, and so he talks about how God the Father is a very, very strong picture of God, the God from the Old Testament. And then Christ came, and he sees Christ as, and he argues for Christ as being a kind of a weaker version of God somehow. He's human as well, and he's fallible. And then the Holy Spirit he sees as an even weaker picture of God, kind of more ethereal, more feminine God or something like that. And so he sees this pattern through history of weaker things replacing stronger things, and then he makes the kind of contrast onto the business world, where he sees, you know, like big established companies being replaced by weaker or softer, you know, so like Uber, as you know, they don't own a single taxi, but it's the world's biggest taxi organization. Airbnb don't have any property, but it's the world's biggest hotel chain now, and something like that. And so his message with this TED talk is like, you know, we need to be rebels, and we need to rebel against the gods, the fathers, or something like that. And I've been sitting with that for quite a bit of time and thinking, like, how do I handle that idea? I don't know, what does that bring up for you?
Yeah, I don't think that really works with Christianity. It's a common, I think it used to be a heresy. I don't remember what name it was, but like the idea that actually, like most, especially in the Orthodox Church, you'll want to say that like the theophanies in the Old Testament, like anytime God appears in the Old Testament, it's actually Christ. So like it's the same person. And if you look at what Christ says and does, I think it's fairly convincing. Like he's, let's say, he's obviously more manifest than in the Old Testament because he's incarnated in flesh. He doesn't just talk through prophets, let's say, but like you have in the Old Testament, God is merciful and he's also vengeful, but you have Christ doing this to people also. He's merciful to some people, and he's always accusing the Pharisees and other hypocritic people of something else. So, and even with then when the Holy Spirit is talking through the church, you have the same thing where the apostles are very merciful to some people, but they're like very unapologetically violent against some others. So it's like I think you can see the same, let's say, mercy and wrath going through. Is just that it's getting more and more incarnated, let's say, or more and more manifest. Whereas it's, let's say, theophanies are less direct in the Old Testament, then they're incarnated in Christ, and then they're incarnated through the saints in the church. But let's see, as far as being rebels, or in general, like seeing that we have to oppose somehow the current powers of the world, I think that goes back to what we said earlier, where like the modern world is sort of just killing itself, really. Like it's running to its course of, it has tried to reduce everything down to a layer of reality that doesn't really exist. It has tried to shortening our attention spans so much that it's sort of just disappearing. These things will naturally have to flip. Or another kind of flip is, like, the most rebellious thing you can do now is to become traditional. It's become like so easy to just rebel against rebellions and rebellions and rebellions and so on, that now the most rebellious thing you can do is just have, let's say, a good job in a family. You'll be a rebel for doing this stuff. So I think this modern worldview is running its course. Like, it has gone through the end of its train of thought, you can say. Like, you cannot reduce things more, you cannot shrink narratives more. So things are just sort of re-enchanting back right now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think for me, a lot of what it goes down to, and that's again why is it important to consider these very fundamental questions? And what comes up for me here is like, what is a person? And in some ways, we have a very atomized idea of what a person is. It's basically based on my physical manifestation in my body, which is a very, very minuscule part of the universe. You know, vanishingly small, actually, which therefore becomes very important and important in some way. So, and especially like, you know, one person 2000 years ago living somewhere in the Middle East, you know, that becomes also vanishingly small in importance. Whereas a more ancient understanding of what a person is, or personhood, at least in the church's understanding, is something far greater, even beyond comprehension. You know, if you understand as God is a person as well, but you know, God is not a person in the level that we are pure persons, but what a person is actually something bigger. And again, that goes back to like consciousness is, you know, this mediating thing between heaven and earth, between reality, between all the paradoxes. The entire cosmos, you know, arises in your consciousness, right? And it seems like the human consciousness is the only thing that can actually, where the universe arises in that way, where we see it, you know, especially with the concepts of good and evil, or good and bad, or something like that, right? And so for me, a fundamental question, and that's what Jordan Peterson really activated in me, going back to that, is, well, is existence good or bad? And that was really the core question. Like the road that he said is like, you know, okay, do we dare to believe that the universe and existence and man or humans are good? Because if that's the way you choose to see the world, then that's the path that you would follow here, right? And that's the path that he was even battling himself with right now, given the pain that he's experiencing.
Yep.
Whereas if I would say more and more, in some of my workshops, I've asked guys, you know, what do you think of the universe? Is it good or bad? And what it's really interesting to see how people answer that as well. And increasingly, a lot of people will say, will use the word neutral, but if you then kind of ask, if you delve into it, you get a lot of negativity, actually. And I think that's maybe a large part of it. And so the Christian ideal is the exact opposite of that. And it's so opposite that it makes it incredibly hard to believe, right? Because of this idea of like, it's not only just good, it's infinitely good. It's you know, it's not just like, oh, there's some like nice heaven after you die. It's like, no, it's you know, everything, including the body, including everything in existence, will become one with God. and you will experience that as yourself, as a completely unique being for all eternity as well, which is like, it goes far beyond anything that our minds can anyway comprehend. Or I don't know, you're the scientist.
But yeah, it really is like jumping into another world. Like you have to learn to see things very differently. And we don't, especially for, let's say, people coming from a more modernistic band, it can be hard to notice how much our perception can shift of things. But if you start being attentive, you'll realize that there's quite a lot to it. A good example I like to take is the way children have to learn to see. Children don't just see things outright. They have to learn to perceive even just objects. And there are experiments to replicate this even in adults. There's a device that was originally made by an American neuroscientist, Bakirita was his name, where you put a kind of a helmet on with a camera on top, and it blindfolds you, but it puts electrodes on your tongue with, like, depending on what areas of like basically the image of the camera is mapped onto your tongue. And of course, when you start using this, you don't see anything. You just feel electrodes on your tongue. But if you actually practice interacting with the world this way, you'll learn to perceive the world through your tongue. And it doesn't take that long. Apparently, within about 15 minutes, you start to see some things. Like, it's very gross initially, but it's enough that you can sort of walk around slightly. And after a few hours, you can even like catch objects and things. So and people describe it as seeing the world in bubbles
coming towards you from.
Wow. I don't think they could like catch a Major League Baseball throw, but like you can catch some some
Yeah.
easy
A
throws.
big pillow or something like that.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, if you did it for a year or for 5 years, like the time it takes a baby to learn to, although,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, our visual sense is different from and it has more nerve endings and more of the brain.
Yeah. It would probably not be as good, but still, like, it at least gets you realizing that perception is something we have to learn, and you'll see it in your daily life once you have this at the back of your mind. If you're, let's say, starting a new sport, you won't see what's happening initially. If you, let's say, try doing jiu-jitsu, the first time you look at the jiu-jitsu match, you won't see what's happening. You'll see two people sort of in a jumbled mess, and at some point you see someone tapping, but you won't see what happened in between. It'll just be chaos. But through time, if you actually practice jiu-jitsu, if you see it, if you talk about it with people, you learn to see the different moves. And if you look at the same fight that used to just be chaos, now you'll be able to see some, okay, this guy is doing this move because he's taking those grips, and this guy is countering by doing this and whatever. So you literally see things that were just chaos to you before. And that's for material things, but it's the same for more spiritual entities like vices and virtues. You have to learn to see these things. When you're younger, you cannot perceive vices in yourself, but as you grow older, you can perceive them. And just because they're harder to see, it takes longer to learn to perceive them. And different cultures are at, let's say, different emphasis on their perception of those patterns. Doesn't mean that because they're harder and there are differences, that it doesn't converge towards the same things. Like the saints in different traditions converge much more than the different people in those traditions. So like all of these patterns that we learn to see, reaching up to stories, like being able to perceive stories, let's say narratives across history and in people's lives and so on. These are things that we need to learn to see, and we can learn to see them. So it makes me very hopeful about all of this stuff. And it explains why, coming back to your question, if, let's say, you want to jump into a Christian story, it will seem very foreign at first, because you have to learn to see so many new things. It's like if you wanted to learn to do jiu-jitsu, you will have to learn to see jiu-jitsu, and it's going to take like 10 years before you're any good at it. So if you want to jump into a traditional story that people have worked on for thousands of years, it's going to take a while for you to learn to see it. You're going to need to undergo serious transformations to do so. And if I go talk to a monk, like, he's going to look like he's in another world, because in many ways he is. Like, he doesn't see the same things I do. He lives in a higher reality where, like, he spends as much time with angels as he spends with, like, the material things that I spend time with. So people can see very different things, and just because they're harder to see doesn't mean that they don't exist. In fact, I mean, if people have been seeing like a certain narrative for thousands of years, it's probably more true than what I'm seeing now in the 21st century, in a modern worldview that has only been around for a few decades. So it really seems like another world, but it could be very well be much truer than the way we currently see things.
So we have this idea of reality, and I guess today we're identifying reality very closely with just what appears to us in our experience moment by moment. And what I hear you're saying is like, well, actually, what appears in your experience moment is very, very conditioned by the story that you've been living up till now. And you're saying it's also possible to jump out of that story and jump into another story. That's a act of conscious will that I can do as a human being by doing what?
It's practice. It's practice. I mean, you have to. So it's good. It's great to have guides, to have people you can talk to about this stuff, to have especially people who live that life more fully than you, because they'll be able to debug problems that you have. They'll be able to suggest things. A good example is like rituals. If you can participate in liturgy is built, among other things, to make you see more of the world. There's even a great story about that in the Bible, in St. Luke's Gospel. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, after Christ has been resurrected, like there are apostles who don't know, and they're very sad, and they're walking towards Emmaus. And then Christ comes to meet them on the road, but they don't recognize him. They're not able to see him. But then what he does is he will talk to them. He will explain to them the scriptures, and he will also have communion with them, like breaking bread. And it's in doing those things, so in doing basically the liturgy, in reading the scriptures and then having communion, then they get to see him. So different traditions will allow you to perceive those patterns to practice. It's as if you want to learn to see the patterns of jiu-jitsu, you have to do jiu-jitsu, you have to train with people, you have to try to do it, and over time your perception will improve. So it's the same things for practicing your narrative perception to better see the patterns in history and the patterns of your life. You have to practice them.
Yeah, and I would add to that community, like what are the narratives or stories or realities that of your communities, that we're all in some kind of community most of the time. So how explicit are that? And then yeah, what are we? I guess what are the rituals that we're doing in those communities? That's what you're talking about as well, right? So participating in the rituals and the stories of those communities as well, and explicitly telling the stories. I think this is something that marketing people have been aware of for a very long time, but done in a very kind of plasticky way, right? Of like storytelling as marketing. But I think they're onto something that most of other
I think
have lost somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're already doing it in a secular sphere. They're just rituals that don't allow us to perceive patterns that are very high. So we will do rituals that will help us see material reality better. So I don't know, maybe we'll all come and watch on the TV some new scientific discovery. Maybe we'll all we'll
go to the Apple Store where the new iPhone comes out.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Go to a sports game.
Sports game. Yeah, we have all kinds of rituals that will reinforce our current perception of the world. But it's running its course, as we've said earlier. We cannot keep reducing things down. We cannot keep shrinking the temporal time span. We cannot keep removing meaning from the world. So it's going to snap back to a world that is much more meaningful, fuller of patterns. And like, in order to not go crazy, in order not to go to new agey or witchcraft kind of stuff, like it's better to do that consciously, to see traditions that have been working and to voluntarily learn to see the world from within those traditions.
Well, that sounds like a good, solid place to finish off the interview, I would say. Got very well around and the importance of tradition. Yeah. We had a conversation on the return of religion some time ago with Alexander Bard and Andrew Sweeney, Zoroastrian and Buddhist as well. And I think that's something that's good. And then a lot of people are still standing kind of like, well, which way do I go? and I think Jordan Peterson is somehow also, standing on that same place right now as well. It's like, well, do I dare to fully walk the path of the ideas that I've been laying out as well? So that's going to be interesting to watch, I guess.
Yeah. Interesting times.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, JP. Great talking to you as always.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.